The cold metal of an alien rifle pressed into the side of my head. The woman holding it was already smiling like she had won. "On your knees," she said. Her voice was flat and pleased with itself. "All of you." I lowered myself slowly, keeping my hands open where she could see them. Around me, 4 members of our outpost staff knelt in a loose half-circle on the cold cargo bay floor. Laura Bennett, our station's chief negotiator, stood frozen near the comm console. 2 more rifles were aimed straight at her chest. None of us carried a weapon. Outpost Kestrel ran on trust and trade agreements, not turrets and battle plating. The closest thing to a weapon anywhere on this station was a cutting torch in the maintenance bay, 3 decks below us. We were a trade outpost at the edge of human space, not a fortress. That had always been the whole point of this place. 20 minutes earlier, this had been a normal meeting about mining rights and shipping lanes. Now it was something else entirely. The woman in front of me called herself Commander Threnna Vask. Only an hour earlier, she had walked through our airlock carrying a folder of trade proposals and a polite practice smile. Now the folder was gone. In its place stood 3 armed guards and a demand that turned my stomach cold. "You have built something valuable here," she said, stepping over a fallen chair without looking down at it. "A shield array strong enough to stop our heavy cannons. My people want the access codes. There is a rival fleet near this system, and they want those codes even more than we do. Now would be a good time to hand them over." Nobody answered her. Laura's eyes flicked toward me for half a second, then snapped back to the rifle near her face. I understood the warning in that glance perfectly. "Stay still. Don't give them a reason." Threnna crouched down until she was level with me. She studied my face the way someone studies an insect they have just stepped on by accident. I worked in cargo logistics, and that was what my badge said. It was all she saw. A man in a gray jumpsuit with soft hands, no rank insignia worth noticing, nothing about him that suggested a problem. She had no reason to look closer. People who never look closer are usually the ones who pay for it later. "You're shaking," she said, almost gently, almost kind. "It's all right. Your species was barely built for this kind of pressure. I'm told you nearly destroyed your own homeworld more than once, long before you ever reached the stars." She turned and said something to one of her guards in her own language. He laughed, a short, ugly sound that echoed off the cargo bay walls. I wasn't shaking. I was counting. 4 guards stood in the room. 3 watched the kneeling staff. 1 stayed fixed on Laura. Their rifles hung low and loose, the careless grip of soldiers who had never once expected resistance from people they considered harmless. The door behind Threnna led to the main corridor, where at least 1 more guard waited near the airlock. The panel beside the comm console controlled the bay's gravity plating. I had rewired that system myself 2 months earlier, after it kept failing during cargo runs, and the same panel, if I remembered correctly, also fed into the corridor's blast doors. None of that showed on my face. None of it needed to. 11 years in the Navy's special operations teach a person something important. A calm expression is a weapon nobody can ever take away. A room gives up every one of its weaknesses within seconds, if a person knows how to look. 2 minutes, Threnna said, straightening up and checking a small device strapped to her wrist. "Give us the codes, and everyone in this room keeps breathing. Refuse, and I start with her." She tilted her head toward Laura. The nearest guard shifted his weight, eager for an excuse to be useful. "The codes aren't mine to give," Laura said. Her voice stayed steady despite the rifle inches from her collarbone. "I don't hold clearance for the shield array. Nobody on this outpost does, not without authorization from the Colonial Council. That council is 3 days away by our fastest ship." "Then find a faster way," Threnna snapped. "Quickly, before my patience runs out completely. If that rival fleet reaches this system first and learns you still hold those codes, what happens to this outpost will no longer be my concern, and they are far less patient than I am." I watched her patience thin with every passing second. I watched her fingers tighten around a rifle she had already stopped pointing at me, because she had decided I wasn't worth the effort. That was her first mistake. She crossed the room toward Laura, grabbed her wrist, and twisted it hard enough to pull a sharp gasp from her throat. "Perhaps a little discomfort will help your memory," Threnna said, leaning close. Laura's knees buckled slightly. Beside me, an older engineer named Owen, a man who had spent 30 years on this outpost without ever once raising his voice, let out a low, helpless sound. He started to rise from his knees before catching himself. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. He understood it at once and went still again. Whatever was about to happen, it needed to be just 1 person moving, not 5. That was Threnna's second mistake, and her last one for quite a while. I had already worked my left wrist loose from the loop of cable the nearest guard had used to bind me. It was a knot meant for securing cargo crates, not someone who had spent years learning to slip restraints in complete darkness. The guard beside me was watching Threnna instead of me. the same way every set of eyes in the room had turned toward the sound of Laura's pain. I moved before he had a chance to turn back. The next several seconds happened faster than anyone in that room, including me, had time to fully register. My palm caught the underside of his rifle and drove it upward, away from the kneeling staff beside me. My other hand closed around his wrist and twisted until the weapon dropped from his fingers. A short, controlled strike to the side of his neck put him on the floor before he understood what had happened to him. The second guard spun toward the noise, his rifle already rising. By the time it finished rising, I was already inside the distance where it stopped mattering. I drove my shoulder into his chest, pinned his arm against the wall, and used his own forward momentum to send him crashing into the comm console. He slid down it and stayed there, dazed, breathing, and very much finished for the day. Shouting filled the cargo bay now, fast words in a language I didn't need to translate to understand. The third guard fired. A bright bolt of energy scorched the wall beside my head instead of finding me. Because I was already moving low and fast toward the gravity panel, I knew better than anyone else on this outpost. I slammed my palm against it. The section of floor beneath him lost its plating for exactly 1 second, long enough for his next shot to go wide and his footing to vanish completely. He hit the deck hard. His rifle skidded away across the floor. Smoke from the scorched wall curled toward the ceiling vents, and somewhere behind me, one of the kneeling staff members let out a sharp breath they had clearly been holding since this whole thing started. As his hand reached for an alarm switch bolted near the door, I crossed the room in 3 strides and made sure it never got there. That left Threnna. She had let go of Laura's wrist the moment the shouting started. Now she was turning toward me with 2 intentions at once. Her rifle came up in one hand, while the other reached for the device strapped to her wrist. The one I guessed was tied to a ship somewhere above us. Calling for backup would have ended this very differently, and she knew it. I closed the gap before either hand finished its job. My fingers caught the barrel of her rifle and forced it toward the ceiling. My other hand clamped down over her wrist device, hard enough to stop her thumb from ever reaching the control beneath it. She twisted, trying to break free, fast and trained and clearly not used to losing a fight this badly. I locked her elbow at an angle that made the rifle fall from fingers that no longer had the strength to hold it. The wrist device came off a second later, useless in my pocket before she even registered it was gone. I turned her, pinned her against the console, and held her there. Not roughly, just completely. The kind of stillness that leaves no question about how a situation has ended. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Her eyes moved across the room, taking in her 4 guards scattered across the floor, all of them breathing, none of them getting up anytime soon. Then she looked at me, really looked, the way she should have looked the moment she first walked through our airlock with that folder under her arm. "Who are you?" she said quietly. It wasn't really a question. It was the sound of someone recalculating everything she had believed to be true about an entire species, in the space of about 30 seconds. "Cargo logistics," I said, like it says on my badge. Laura had moved away from the console. She was rubbing her wrist, watching me with an expression caught somewhere between shock and quiet satisfaction. "He used to be a little more than that," she said. "Before this outpost, Jack spent 11 years as a Navy SEAL. I don't imagine your intelligence reports mention that part." Something shifted in Threnna's face. It was a kind of recognition that had nothing to do with translation software, and everything to do with finally understanding the true size of what she had walked into. Her people had studied humanity from orbit for years. They had decided we were soft because our cities looked fragile from a distance, and our weapons looked outdated beside theirs. Nobody on her side had ever bothered to ask why a species that had nearly destroyed its own homeworld more than once still managed to reach the stars anyway, and kept reaching further every single year after that. Softness was never the trait that kept anyone alive that long. Quiet was never the same thing as harmless. A voice crackled through the corridor outside. One of her remaining guards was trying the door near the airlock, demanding to know what had happened to his commander. I caught Laura's eye and nodded toward the comm console. She understood at once. She reached past Threnna to the panel I had rewired months earlier, and sealed the corridor's blast door with a flick of 2 switches, before the guard outside ever got close enough to matter. There were no more shots and no more shouting. Only a quiet, heavy door now stood between us and anyone left on the other side of it. "Your shield codes," I said quietly, keeping her pinned with the same calm I had carried since the moment her rifle first touched my head. "We're never leaving this room. Not today. And not after threatening people who never raised a weapon against you in the first place." She didn't answer, and she didn't need to. Beyond the sealed door, I could finally hear our own outpost alarm catching up to everything that had already happened. Boots pounded down a different corridor as our small security team arrived. Far too late to matter. I held Threnna there until they reached us, until the rest of her crew near the airlock saw their commander disarmed, stripped of her wristcom, and pinned without a single shot fired by our side. They made the only sensible decision left available to them. They lowered their own weapons and waited quietly for whatever came next. It took 3 days for her superiors to respond to what had happened on Outpost Kestrel. The message that finally arrived wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it wasn't another threat either. It read like the kind of careful, measured language people use after they have learned something the hard way and have no intention of repeating the lesson anytime soon. The shield array stayed exactly where it was, fully under our control. The trade terms that followed in the weeks afterward looked nothing like the ones Threnna had walked in demanding. The guards we had restrained were handed back to their own people unharmed, fed, and treated with far more decency than they had shown anyone in that cargo bay. That difference mattered to us, even on the worst day this outpost had ever seen. Word of what happened on a quiet trade outpost spread faster through certain channels than anyone expected, reaching ears far beyond the rival fleet Threnna had been so worried about. Laura found me in the cargo bay a few days later. I was running an inventory check, like nothing unusual had happened that week at all. "You could have told me, Jack," she said, leaning against a crate with her arms folded. "About the whole Navy SEAL thing." "Didn't seem relevant," I said, scanning a shipment list. "I left that life behind when I took this posting. I figured a quiet outpost counting crates was about as far from a battlefield as a person could get." "And was it?" she asked. "Quiet, I mean." "Mostly," I said, "until it wasn't." She laughed and shook her head. After a moment, she went back to her own work, and I went back to mine, counting crates instead of guards. That was the actual job. It mattered just as much on the quiet days as it had on the one day it almost wasn't quiet at all. Threnna Vask never came back to Outpost Kestrel. Somewhere out past the edge of human space, in briefings I will never see and reports I will never read, I like to think she is still explaining to someone exactly what happened on the day she decided a quiet man in a gray jumpsuit wasn't worth watching closely enough. She threatened the wrong human. Every version of that story, told in whatever language her people use to pass along warnings, probably ends exactly the same way.